Hello, my name is Catalina, and I'm a nurse at a large hospital in Texas. I won't say which one to keep my identity hidden. I've worked in the emergency room for 20 years, including many night shifts. It's a challenging job with long, stressful hours. You never know when someone might arrive in critical condition, or when someone you've been providing the best possible care for might pass away. Despite the difficulties, there are moments when we save lives and make a real difference. I've also witnessed some truly terrifying things. What I'm about to tell you happened when I was relatively new to the job, and it's one of the most unsettling experiences I've ever had. It was mid-October, and the night was dark and stormy. I remember that clearly because I've always been afraid of thunder, and that night it just wouldn't stop. My colleague, whom I'll call John, told me that lightning was striking the hospital, which explained the loud crashes. The power in the entire area around the hospital had gone out, and we were operating on the backup generator. Even the generator's light flickered a few times, and there was a growing concern among the nursing staff and some doctors that the old generator might fail. This was serious because we had several patients in intensive care who depended on machines to stay alive. It was a very difficult night with a lot of tension in the air. You could feel everyone's nervousness, including mine. At around 2 a.m., I was filling out reports and checking on some patients who had arrived with respiratory problems. We had them on oxygen masks when an ambulance called us. They were on their way with a patient who had second and third degree burns over most of his upper torso, arms, and legs, practically 2/3 of his body. It sounded really serious, and we prepared to receive and care for him. The newest members of the team had no idea how horrible it would be. When I was a student, I saw some cases of burns, some quite severe, but nothing as extreme and painful as what happened when he got out of that ambulance. That night, only one thing managed to make more noise than the storm: the screams of that man who was breaking through the emergency doors before the ambulance could even stop. There was nothing in the ambulance that could mitigate his pain, and when they got him out, I watched in horror as that poor man's entire body was charred black. I was surprised he still felt anything, because the burns were so severe that all his nerves must have been destroyed. That guy should have been dead, or at least in shock, but he wasn't. There he was, screaming in pain and clinging to life with all his might. We rushed him to the resuscitation room while a group of doctors and nurses tried to stabilize him. Intubation was impossible, and a cocktail of painkillers wasn't enough to ease his pain. That poor guy kept screaming, and his eyes, those brown eyes, flipped frantically from side to side, searching for something, for someone. Suddenly, his gaze was fixed on me, and he never looked away. It was a powerful moment. He was a young man, no more than 30. Somehow, we managed to stabilize him, and he fell asleep. We began superficially removing the pieces of clothing he must have been wearing during the accident, which were stuck to his skin. The black, burned fabric looked like scales. Then we took him to the burn ward. When we asked what had happened to him, the paramedics who were still nearby told us that his wife had doused him in gasoline and set him on fire. The cause was unknown, but he had run out of the house, and the neighbors had heard his screams and called 911. A short time later, the police arrived with the handcuffed woman. She had second-degree burns on her hands and arms, but that wasn't a surprise considering the magnitude of the fire that had consumed the other patient. What surprised me and everyone in the emergency room was how similar that woman was to me. We were both white, with brown hair, upturned noses, and brown eyes. We were roughly the same age, and even our builds were very similar. The only difference was that her hair was a little straighter, but otherwise the shape of our faces, our lips, everything was identical. I remembered the look on that man's face and realized he had mistaken me for his wife. However, that woman showed not the slightest remorse, and she didn't care when she was told that if her husband died, she would go to jail for murder. In fact, she smiled. The storm outside the hospital was only getting worse, and I still had that very strange feeling in my body, a chill that ran from the tips of my fingers to the back of my neck. If I could have, I would have gotten in my car and driven straight home. It was one of the few nights I wished I had the power to leave the hospital, but what I didn't know is that it could get worse. The doctor who was on duty that night, treating the case of that young man who had been burned, pointed me out to look after him. There were other patients in the burn ward, fortunately not as seriously injured, but we were still short-staffed. The doctor thought that if the patient woke up and saw me, who looked identical to his attacker, he would surely panic. However, that doctor was still a stranger to me, and I didn't want to contradict him or correct him. Sometime later, I had the chance to ask him, and he told me that he didn't notice the resemblance between that woman and me, which I thought was understandable since I discovered that in addition to being noble, he was also quite absent-minded. Well, no more than 10 minutes had passed since we left the patient in the burn ward when a thunderous scream shook the entire ground floor of the hospital. Just so you understand, the emergency wing was at the south entrance of the hospital, and the burn ward was at the back of the wing about 250 meters away, along a long corridor where other areas were located, such as intensive care, trauma, and operating rooms. His scream again penetrated walls and doors and frightened us all, as it was impossible for the painkillers we gave him to have worn off so quickly. John and I ran to help him, and there he was, screaming in agony and thrashing violently in the bed. I know we both thought the same thing at that moment. It seemed that in addition to the sharp and unbearable physical pain, this man was also consumed by a horrible emotional pain, the pain of having been betrayed. I stayed by his side for the rest of the night, making sure he slept soundly. However, it was a losing battle, and at around 3 a.m., after a brief moment of lucidity where I saw him open his eyes and cry silently, he succumbed to his injuries. However, and unfortunately for all the emergency room staff, that wouldn't be the end of his story in the hospital. It would be up to me personally to confirm firsthand that the supernatural exists and that spirits are very real. The first incident that I know of took place a few days later, also on the night shift. I was in a ward resting my legs when a distant call made me react. I got up from my seat, and the voice came from the burn ward. It was a patient who had suffered an accident with boiling water. His legs were in bad shape and he was in a lot of pain, but he would undoubtedly recover with the necessary care. However, he wasn't calling me because of the pain, but because of something else. As soon as he saw me come in, he looked me straight in the eyes and yelled desperately, "For God's sake, why aren't you helping him?" I stood in the doorway, confused by his request, and asked him who he was talking about. He didn't seem to understand my answer and insisted sharply, "What do you mean, who?" "The guy in the corner." He'd been screaming like crazy for 10 minutes. At that moment, I felt like someone had taken an ice cube and rolled it from my neck to my legs. My whole body went cold, and my hands began to shake uncontrollably because I knew there were no other patients in the ward that night. The lights were dim to avoid disturbing that specific patient, but since he was awake, I turned them on full blast and stared at the curtain stretcher in the back. I moved slowly toward it, hoping with all my might to see a patient I didn't recognize inside. But when I carefully pulled back the curtain, what I feared most happened. Behind the curtain, there was absolutely no one. An empty bed, without a single wrinkle on its white sheets. The patient also noticed that no one was there and began to cry out that he wasn't crazy and that he was awakened by a patient's screams. They were horrible screams that pierced his ears, and he felt very sad for him, as he truly seemed to be suffering. I, however, had to insist that he was the only one in the ward, and upon hearing this, he requested that he be moved from there immediately. That wasn't possible, but I promised to stay with him at least until he fell asleep again. So I did. And although nothing else happened that night, that strange feeling of confusion stayed with me for several hours until my shift was over. I didn't see anything or feel the chair I was sitting in being moved, but there was something about the atmosphere that kept me from getting comfortable. A strange chill that seeped into my bones, and the insistent feeling that something was watching me, even though I couldn't see it. In fact, I had the impression that something was standing behind me. It was like a pressure on my back, a tightness that wouldn't go away and would circle around the room. It didn't stop until I left the ward about 15 minutes later. 2 days later, I was arriving for my shift around 8 p.m. and noticed there was some commotion in the emergency room. Not the kind caused by a sudden influx of patients, but rather the commotion caused by something new among the hospital staff. I walked over and greeted my colleagues, asking what was happening, and one of them, whom I'll call Gabby, told me that she and another colleague had seen something impossible. A young man with a charred body, advancing from the burn ward and disappearing down the opposite hallway as if he were heading for the X-ray area. Obviously, they searched everywhere for him, but couldn't find him. They weren't there the night of the incident, and when other colleagues like John asked her what that young man looked like, well, we all knew it was him, the young man who died that morning. There were only 3 other patients in the burn ward, and no one was missing, so they had undoubtedly seen a supernatural manifestation. Soon, everyone began confessing that they had seen or felt strange things in the emergency room and throughout the first floor of the hospital. They heard moans of pain or saw someone with blackened skin out of the corner of their eyes. I hadn't felt anything particular in the mornings, but I would have to work the night shift for the rest of the week. And in retrospect, those stories predisposed me to see and feel some things, but others were completely real, and I'm sure of it. That same night, for example, I was meeting with another nurse caring for a patient when we suddenly heard a thunderous scream coming from the hallway. We immediately saw each other's faces and ran outside to see what was happening. But when we looked out, nothing was happening. My colleague went to check, and I stayed with the patient. She asked me what we were seeing, and I, barely able to form my words, asked her if she hadn't heard that scream. She looked at me in confusion before replying that she hadn't heard anything. She was an older woman and didn't seem like the joking type. A few minutes later, my colleague returned, assuring me that no one had screamed. We both heard it, just the 2 of us. Throughout the shift, I once again felt like something was stalking me. A weight on my shoulders and a discomfort in my neck that wouldn't go away marked my entire shift that day and for the rest of the week. Every so often, I'd see something out of the corner of my eye, but considering my job requires me to stay alert for so many hours, so many days a week, it wasn't hard to deduce that it was due to fatigue. It was all fatigue. How foolish of me. It was obvious something was after me. It was obvious that someone had mistaken me for its killer and would soon show its true colors. It was the end of October, and the night was stormy again. Once again, the air in the hospital was tense, and once again, I made an effort to ignore the thunder that rattled the windows. The truth was that the night was otherwise quiet, although no one mentioned it to avoid bad luck. I, however, was having that discomfort in my shoulders, and the fatigue was taking its toll. I told my colleague I was going to the bathroom to wash my face and cross the long hallway, my eyes fixed on the back wall, near the entrance to the burn ward. I wasn't thinking about anything in particular, but suddenly the door to the ward opened. I stared at it, waiting for someone to come out, but it closed again. I didn't give it much thought, assuming it might have been a patient who was getting restless and headed for the bathroom. I stopped in front of one of the sinks and splashed my face several times with cold water in an attempt to wake myself up. Why not? Hoping that somehow the water would magically wash away the discomfort in my shoulders and neck. However, when I opened my eyes and looked in the mirror, I witnessed something horrifying. Behind me, with a furious and distorted face, was the patient from the burn ward who had died weeks ago. His skin charred black. It was only for an instant, and in the blink of an eye he was gone. But the shock was enough to make me let out a scream that frightened everyone in the emergency room. A doctor opened the door and found me crying on the floor. It took me a long time to calm down, and when I told them what I had seen, they decided to remain silent. Everyone knew what it was, but explaining it to the hospital management would be impossible. I wasn't alone for a single minute for the rest of the shift, and luckily, I didn't have to work nights for 2 weeks. What is certain is that as quickly as that entity began to manifest, it disappeared from our lives. A good friend explained to me that perhaps his spirit had found peace or forgiveness, and that's why he left the place where he died. It was a spirit passing through, seeking its place in denial for having lost his life. And as for the unease I'd been feeling, we both came to the conclusion that it was him, who thought I was his wife, who was the cause of his suffering and death. It certainly scares me a lot to think about it today, and I hope he has truly found peace, or that at least he is now tormenting the person truly responsible for his death. If you're enjoying the video, please subscribe the channel for future videos, and like and share with your friends. Good evening. My name is Lisa, and I work in downtown Chicago, in the offices of a major bank. I'm in charge of the department that handles most of the problems and complaints from our largest clients. I'm not talking about everyday people, but rather large companies and businesses that require special attention due to the sums they handle. It's a very large department. There are only 5 of us, but our work is important and we often have to stay late solving disasters. It's during these late hours, when the office is completely deserted and silent, that I've personally experienced a couple of supernatural events. But first, let me give you a little context about the space where I work. The bank's office is spread across the entire floor and was previously separated by walls and thin blinds. This allowed each bank department to be isolated in its own area and avoided distractions from things happening on the other side of the office. A few years after I joined the bank, they did a major remodel, replacing the walls with enormous glass windows that turned the office into a gigantic fishbowl with almost no privacy. The change wasn't well received by most people, but there was nothing we could do about it. We now had a huge interconnected office, separated by glass windows and columns that allowed us to see each of our colleagues. Before the remodel, I experienced a couple of isolated incidents that I think are worth mentioning. The first was around 8 p.m. I was exhausted and decided to go to one of the 2 office bathrooms before going home. I entered and noticed that the first of the 4 stalls was locked. I went to the third, and once inside, I began to hear a faint crying sound that bothered me quite a bit. I assumed it was the person in the first stall. When I left, I asked her if she was okay or if she needed help. I didn't get a response, so I started washing my hands. However, that faint crying didn't stop. I've always been very empathetic, so I felt a little sorry for leaving her alone crying. I assured her I'd be outside for a few minutes if she wanted to talk, and to my surprise, she replied with a very soft, almost whispered, "Thank you." She sounded like a young woman. I left the bathroom and waited for her for a couple of minutes, but she didn't come out. That's when things got weird. I went back in and asked if she was ready to talk, and I felt a pit in my stomach when I saw the stall was open and completely empty. I opened the other 3 stalls, hoping to see the girl somewhere, but no one was in the bathroom. I stood by the door the whole time, so I'm pretty sure no one came out of the bathroom. And yes, it was the only way out. That night, I went home with a very strange feeling. My husband told me that maybe the crying was coming from another floor, but the voice was real, and I heard it inside the bathroom. Without a doubt, one of the most disconcerting moments of my life, but not the last. The next paranormal event happened a few months before the office remodel. This time, it was 7:30 p.m., and my team had already left. The building was completely empty, except for the security guards, some cleaning staff, and the elevator operators. The building still maintained the tradition of the operators, but to my surprise, I called the elevator, and it arrived completely empty. I got on, confused, and pressed the button for the ground floor. But to my surprise, the elevator slammed shut and began to ascend at full speed. It was a tall building, so the elevator went up and down pretty quickly. For a moment, I felt the push of the elevator on my head. I assumed for a moment it was a mechanical failure, and of course I felt dizzy and afraid that for some reason the elevator was going to suddenly break loose. Suddenly, the elevator stopped on one of the highest floors of the tower. I felt as if I was avoiding it for a moment, and suddenly the door opened, revealing a dark floor in total and absolute silence. I pressed the ground floor button several times, but the elevator didn't move or close its doors for a long minute. It was strange, but it became terrifying when, after a few seconds, I began to hear whispers at the end of that horrible hallway, and with the help of the elevator light, I saw shadows moving from one office to another. I kept pressing the button for the elevator to close and get us off, and as suddenly as it first went up, the elevator suddenly began to descend. It returned to the floor where my office was and then went down to the ground floor. There was one of the repairmen who greeted me with his usual good humor. I asked him if the elevator was broken, and he said no, but he had to go to the bathroom for a minute. I returned to that floor a few days later during the day, and there's nothing to report. It's like any other, but I've never dared to visit it at night. I felt something sinister about that place, and I don't know if it was because I was afraid the elevator light would go out or if I was actually in some kind of danger, but since then I haven't dared ride the elevators in that building alone. shortly after the office renovations took place. It was a rather unpleasant time at work, but 3 months later, I was ready. Now, the place is really big with a lot of employees, and I'm far from knowing everyone who works here. Occasionally, I'd bump into new people in the hallways, in the bathroom, or waiting for the elevator. But honestly, it wasn't unusual for me to occasionally bump into someone who'd been working at the office for 3 years and whom I'd never seen before. I thought this latest occurrence, which repeated itself over the course of several weeks, was the case. It so happens that once I was late with some reports. I don't like taking work home, so I stayed at the office late to finish it. I was tired, but I finally finished everything around 9 p.m. It was really late, so I got up from my desk and, for the first time all night, noticed I wasn't the only one in the office. In the distance, in a cubicle in the customer service area, I could see the dim light of a screen and the silhouette of someone sitting in front of it. I was surprised that someone was still there at that time, so I went over to say hello and offer some help. Maybe a coffee, a glass of water, anything to make this unfortunate person feel better, as they had to stay even longer than me. As I said before, the office had become a giant fishbowl, and apart from a few walls I could see in all directions. I approached without losing sight of him, and suddenly, when I passed a corner with a thick column and a high wall, he was gone. He disappeared from 1 second to the next, and his screen was off. My immediate thought wasn't that he was a spirit or anything like that. Maybe he ran out of there, or had I finished right then and there. I waved out loud, hoping for a response, but no one answered. It was very strange, and I felt the hairs on my arms prickling. It was best if I got out of there. When I said hello to the operator, I asked if he'd happened to see anyone else come down from this floor. He said no. A week later, one of our most important accounts was having problems with some banking transactions. A colleague I'll call Tina and I were focused on solving the problem, and we were so focused that it wasn't until I finished that I noticed the mysterious employee standing there at the same desk as last time. I wanted to confirm that I wasn't the only one who saw him, so I immediately pointed him out to Tina. She assured me that she saw him too and asked if I knew him. As soon as I told her the anecdote, without taking my eyes off him, Tina suggested we surround him. That way, he wouldn't be able to leave suddenly. We were almost finished with the job, so we kept glancing at him, making sure he didn't leave. A few minutes later, we got up from our desks and left the office. Tina told me she'd wait by the door, right in the elevator hallway, and that I should go say hello. I ventured back through the dark office, glancing at him while Tina put things away. And just as I turned a corner, he disappeared. I searched for him carefully, glancing at Tina from a distance, but she seemed more scared than I was and frantically signaled for me to run toward her. That scared me a lot. I felt as if my legs and arms were suddenly on fire, and I don't think I've ever run anywhere so fast. When I reached the office exit, Tina was shaken and, with a trembling voice, told me he disappeared. I was watching him, and suddenly his silhouette vanished. The screen suddenly went black. We were both terrified and didn't know how to explain what had just happened. We stood in the hallway for a few minutes, waiting to see him moving between the desks and office areas, but there wasn't the slightest movement. In fact, I regret staying there because I started to get a little afraid of the office. That space, which was always full of people, looked terrifying with the lights off, and any slightest sound made us jump in our seats. In the end, we decided to leave. Several weeks went by without me seeing him at night. Work was light and overtime wasn't necessary. But the last time I saw him, I felt the need to shout good night before leaving the office. I knew I was alone. I had accepted that the thing on the desk wasn't a person anymore, but I still shouted it. He answered me in an unintelligible whisper that made me feel sick to my stomach. Every second I stood in front of the elevator door, I felt like something was watching me from the office window, and I didn't dare turn around, but its presence was so intense that if even vanishing wasn't proof enough that this entity was supernatural, the shock it caused in me at that moment was. I haven't seen it again in the last year, but I attribute that to the fact that I haven't been alone at night. We've always stayed in groups of 5 or 6 people. However, something tells me that on lonely nights, that entity is still here. Yes, I'm writing this from the office in my spare time, and my nerves are on edge. as if these entities could somehow know I'm talking about them. This building undoubtedly holds many mysteries, and although it's not a topic I usually discuss with my colleagues to maintain professionalism, the truth is that the subject has come up at the occasional Christmas party, and I know I'm not the only one who has experienced strange events in the office, in the elevator, or on the building stairs. It's a very enigmatic place for me, and although I can't say its exact location, as it would bother me if curious people came to disturb our space because of me, I can tell you one thing. Terrifying places are hidden in the heart of Chicago. This building, behind a modern facade, is the enclosure of otherworldly beings, and I'm completely sure of it. Hello, my name is Alex, and I'm from Houston. I've been working on a garbage collection truck for a couple of years. It's a dirty and slightly unpleasant job, but generally quite peaceful. Plus, my coworkers are nice, and after a while, you get used to the smell and the cockroaches. What I still can't get used to are the shadows and the strange events that happen along the way. Since it's a night job, the darkness of the streets surrounds us. And for me, who's somewhat susceptible to paranormal events, it's impossible not to notice that there are sometimes things on the corners, in the alleys. And as I'll tell you in this story, sometimes things accompany us as we travel around the city. It all happened in early February, and it was very cold. I remember the wind burning my face as we walked down the street. I hung out outside the truck on the back next to a colleague named Joe. The truck is big, one of those with a huge press that crushes the trash and compacts it. The night was going like any other, and I think Joe and I were talking about soccer or something when we stopped at one of the stops to pick up garbage bags from a corner. That was the first moment I knew something strange was happening, although I couldn't say why. It was just a feeling. My heart raced for no apparent reason, and I looked around in confusion. But apart from lonely streets with a few parked cars, I didn't see anything. Up until that moment, it had been a normal day, collecting the garbage and putting it in the truck, pressing the press button, and hanging back on the truck. But after that stop, my eyes started to wander. I looked around insistently, and Joe asked me if I was okay, since I seemed very distracted. Just as I was about to say yes, something bothered me again. Again, my heart raced, and the hairs on the back of my neck immediately stood up. It was as if someone was watching me. And again, I felt very uneasy. In the end, I had to admit to him that I felt a little sick, that something strange was happening to me. Just then, before he could answer, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye on top of the truck. I turned around quickly, and even though it was only for a second, I could clearly see the hand and head of a pale person on top of the truck. I wanted to scream, but it was as if my throat suddenly blocked, and I didn't fall because my hand gripped the handle so tightly that it was difficult for anyone to pull me off the truck at that moment. The driver braked again in another direction. Instead of collecting trash with the others, I climbed onto the roof of the truck. The adrenaline propelled me to climb to confirm that what I saw was real, but when I got to the top, there was nothing. I started hyperventilating, and although my colleagues called me and asked what was wrong, I didn't respond. Joe tugged on the hem of my pants, and that's when I came to. I told them I'd seen someone on top of the garbage truck. They laughed a little since that was impossible. There were 5 of us, including the driver, and no one besides me had seen anyone. They knew I was superstitious, and that's why they insisted on continuing the trip, since we weren't going to stop the workday because I'd seen another one of my ghosts. I also wanted to think that it had all been my imagination. However, the reality was different. We got back on the truck. I looked at my watch and it was almost midnight. I was still nervous, although at the same time I felt a little calmer. And Joe started asking me if I had slept well and all that. Up until that moment, no one had ever seen or experienced what I had. And in fact, it was already a running joke among my colleagues to ask me if there was a ghost near where we were. I told Joe that I was fine, but that I was sure I had seen something on the truck. We were silent for a few seconds, and suddenly my heart started racing again, just like the first time. I let out a scream and tried to concentrate on my work and ignore any strange feelings. However, it wasn't me who let out a scream this time, but Joe. I turned around and Joe was petrified in front of the truck, staring fixedly at the space where we had put the garbage bags. The press was working as if someone had pressed it, but no one up until that point had pressed the button. Another colleague asked him what was wrong, and in the most firm yet terrified voice I've ever heard, Joe replied that he'd seen someone inside the warehouse. This time they took it more seriously, and a somewhat impulsive friend named Eric started banging on the walls of the truck, yelling at whatever was in the truck to get out of there. Needless to say, we didn't get any response, and the truck driver then told us to cut the racket and get back to work. There was now a palpable atmosphere of nervousness in the truck, and Joe was beside himself with surprise. I asked him if he saw the same thing I did, and he wasn't even sure. He only told me that there was something pale with long black hair staring back at him, hidden in the garbage. For a second, I feared that it might be a body, a murder victim, and not something supernatural. But that thought was dismissed when the palpitations returned. I looked in all directions and saw it again on the ceiling, staring at me for an instant before it disappeared above. It was terrifying because, despite being somewhat accustomed to seeing strange things, there was a sense of terrible danger. This thing conveyed a threat and a panic that felt foreign and difficult to control. That's why, in a way, I was grateful when finally, after about 20 minutes of traveling and movements out of the corner of my eye, I saw something that would have made my blood run cold. Standing in a dark corner was that tall, pale figure with black hair. I stared at it, and although I couldn't see its face, only its arms, I knew he was staring back at me. Without a doubt, this is the most terrifying thing I've seen in my entire time working as a collector. And although I've tried to find an explanation for what Joe and I saw, it simply doesn't exist. The only thing we're both sure of is that night an entity that wasn't from this plane traveled with us for over half an hour.